In the last lecture, we learned about a very important concept of moving data from a child to a parent component by utilizing props to receive a function from the parent component, which we call in the child component. And this is closely related to another key concept which we also already used without even knowing. And that's a concept called lifting state up. Now, what is that about? Consider this basic component tree, which is roughly what we have in this demo application, where we have an app component, which in turn renders an expenses and a new expense component. Now, in this case, the new expense component is a component which generates some data, some state. In our example application, we are fetching some user input here. Now, it is quite common that you do generate or fetch data in a component, but that you might not need that data in that component. Instead, we need it in another component, in the expenses component. That's where this generated data is needed in the end. Slightly transformed, packed into an object, but it is the data we fetch in new expense. So naturally, we would like to hand that data over. But that doesn't work like this because we have no direct connection between two sibling components. Instead, as you learned by now, we can only communicate from parent to child and from child to parent. That's why, in such cases, like we have it here, we utilize the closest component, the closest parent component, which has direct or indirect access to both involved components. In this case, the app component. The app component in our application has access to both the new expense and the expenses component because it renders both components in its returned JSX code. That's why we want to utilize that, because we can now store our state in that closest involved component, so in that parent component which has access to both involved components, by lifting our state up. So by passing our generated state data from the new expense to the app component. And that's what we're already doing in this demo application. We're doing this by utilizing props, by calling the function we receive on the onAddExpense prop. That alone is not lifting the state up. That's just calling a function we receive through props. But then we do something important. We actually do pass data to that function which we call here. We pass the expense data to the function we receive on the onAddExpense prop. So we're passing data to that function, and by doing that, we're lifting that data, that state, up. We're not keeping it in the new expense component. We're not keeping expense data there. Instead, we are lifting it up to the app component so that in there we can use it. Like an addExpense handler, where at the moment we are logging it to the console. Now we're not yet managing that data as state here. Instead, we're just logging it to a console. But in the next course section, we are going to manage this whole array here as state, and we are going to add the expense to that array. And we are already passing down that array to the expenses component. Because that's the other part of this lifting the state up concept. We are lifting the state up, we are passing data up to some parent component, because we either need that data directly in the app component, or, as it's the case in our demo application, and as it is quite common, because we then want to pass that data down to another component via props. That's what we did in the last course lecture. And that is an important concept. You will hear the term lifting the state up quite a bit when you are working with React, also later in the course. And whenever you hear that, it is about moving data from a child component to some parent component to either use it there or to then pass it down to some other child component. And as a side note, this does not just work if you have the app component which interacts with two direct child components. Instead, in this example already, the new expense component is actually not the component which generates the data which we're passing up. Instead, it's the expense form component which generates that data. It's that component which works with state and which fetches user input and stores user input. And that component then passes up that fetched data to the new expense component. So here we are already lifting state up. And then we're lifting it up even further to the app component, since it's the app component which is then the first component in line, which does not just have access to the new expense and expense form component, but also to the expenses component. And since the expenses component is the component where we need the data in the end, it is the app component where we want to lift our state up to. Now, as you will see throughout this course, it's not always that root app component to which you want to lift your state up. Instead, the goal is to lift it up just as high as necessary in your component tree until you have a component which has both access to the components that generate data as well as the components that need data. That might be the app component, but that could also be another component. Again, you are going to see this quite frequently throughout this course.